Hey, hi folks. Thanks for coming. I'm Ed Friedman, Chair of Friends of Merry Meeting Bay, and welcome. This is the one, two, three, four, fifth program of our 28th year of doing Winter Speaker Series. Um, I want to thank Martin McDonough, who is our technical person and one of our web coordinators, who's on the call here, and of course Marissa. Um, who is going to be our guest tonight. And thank you all for coming. I'm going to run through a few slides of who Friends of Merry Meeting Bay is, who we are, what we do, and then introduce our guest. We are recording. Martin, I hope you are too. I am here. If you don't want to be recorded, now's the time to sign out. If you have questions during the presentation, probably the easiest thing to do is to write them down in the chat box, and uh, I will moderate them to the best of my ability, or one of us will, at, at the end of the presentation. Yeah, I think that's it. So without further ado, let's see if slide advances here. There. So yeah, as a lot of you know, and actually I don't even see who's on the call yet. Um, we are a unique organization that we take a very holistic approach to the environment, focused, of course, on Merry Meeting Bay, but well beyond. And we do a lot of actually supporting national issues through letters to representatives, congressional representatives, other policymakers, in conjunction with groups like the Endangered Species Coalition, folks like that. So, but we engage in research. We often it's cutting edge. We let that research inform our advocacy most of the time. We are a land trust, so we protect some land, and we have an active education program in the schools. And there'll just be a few pictures, slides of, for example, kind of slides. These are a little bit old, so you don't see, for instance, some of our PFAS monitoring on here. But we're doing a lot of, actually, I flew a first eagle flight of the year yesterday, more reconnoitering flight. But actually, there was one bird nesting already up on Pleasant Pond. And that's looking at about 70, 80 nests in a big loop from kind of Auburn area over to Hollowell, Augusta, down the river to here, down to Bath, back up the Androscoggin. So, multi-year circulation study, which is really interesting, is on our on our website. And I mentioned this because um, of the talk of subject tonight, and I'm sure a lot of people might like to know whether or not we have green crabs up here, where they are in the system, and ties into how the water moves around here and what flows in and what flows out, how hard it is to get out of the bay if you're water. So anyway, check that out sometime. Again, a strong voice for advocacy, nature for nature's sake. A lot of fish migration work, river restoration, turbine mortality issues. That's what happened to that out migrating eel, got munched in the Benton Falls turbine. Fish kills in Brunswick as well. So the Brunswick Dam is up for relicensing. It only happens every 50 years or so. So we and a number of groups are very engaged in that process with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission right now. And
Are we on?
so someone should get muted there. I just heard someone say something. All right. And again, active education, a little less in the class since COVID hit, but we're back to doing our bay days outside and get lots of kids outside getting dirty, having fun, as you can see, and getting away from the darn devices. And protected over 1,500 acres of land. Now, directly, most of it wildlife habitat. That's our focus, as opposed to trails and stuff. We have plenty of trails to walk on. If you like tonight's program or you want to see any of our others, we do record them. And we've been recording them for about 10 years or so anyway. And if you go to our homepage at f1b.org or friendsofmarinebay.org, scroll down to the education section, you'll see a speaker series video thing here, and you can click there and you'll get to this and other programs. And Martin should have this up within a couple of few days. Okay. Season calendar for the year. And I do want to call your attention to this next one in March. Woman after my own heart, Hellcat of Conservation. Um, Subtitle in the book that Diana Fermansky wrote about Rosalie Edge, saving nature from the conservationists. So that should be really interesting. One, and you know, a lot of people have, or some people have missed having these meetings in person. It's really nice in the winter when the weather's a factor not to do that. And it's really nice to have the Zoom program because we can have people like Diana, who's in Colorado, you know, or Bud Warren, who's way up in northern Maine now, Mark Baker in, you know, Oregon, join us. So I like it. So Marissa McMahan is the Senior Director of Fisheries at Manomet, and she will tell us what Manomet is. Her research focuses on restoring the ecosystem productivity and strengthening and diversifying fishery resources in the state through, you know, stakeholder partnerships, community engagement, and knowledge co-production. And we obviously need to be diversifying, you know, fishery resources, or for that matter, any other natural resource when and if and when we start to get invasive species here that, you know, may be out competing the local species. So, and that gets into adaptive fishery co-management, which she works on, and elevating the importance of stakeholder participation in these decision-making processes. Prior to becoming a scientist, Marissa worked as a commercial fisher for many years, which hopefully she'll say a few words about what and where she fished. So again, we host this program October through May, the second Wednesday of each month. And we hope you'll enjoy tonight's program and join us again. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And Marissa, thank you again for joining us. And you can start to share.
Great. Thanks, Ed. Thanks for the introduction. And hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here and to have a new audience to share some of our work on green crabs with. I'm going to try to get the slideshow up and going. Can everyone see that?
Looks good. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks again for having me. As Ed said, I work at Manomet Conservation Sciences. I'll talk about that in just a moment, but just to introduce myself, I am from Georgetown, so not directly in the Merrymeeting Bay area, but pretty close to it at the mouth of the Kennebec. And I'm joining you from Georgetown today. I still live here. I grew up in a fishing family, mostly fishing for lobster, and I hold a commercial lobster license myself. I don't use it at this point in time, but have spent a lot of time fishing on lobster boats in particular. And so that's really a big part of how I do my research, really trying to, you know, work with fishing industry members to understand the issues that they're facing and understand their observations on the water, and then work collaboratively to find solutions. So my organization that I work for, Manomet, I'll preface this by saying, don't try to read everything on this slide. I'm mostly just using this slide for the map. But if you're not familiar with Manomet, we're a nonprofit, a conservation nonprofit that was founded in 1969. And our headquarters is actually in Plymouth, Massachusetts. We originally were formed as a bird observatory, so a lot of our work still to this day is focused on both land birds and shorebirds. But since then, we've expanded into many other sectors, including fisheries. our work is really throughout the entire Western Hemisphere, which is why I have this map up here, just showing sort of all of the different places that we have people on the ground doing work. And in fact, about half of our staff now is actually based out of Latin America. So we do, a fairly broad geographic scale of work. Our fisheries work, though, is really specifically focused on the Gulf of Maine, which is an area experiencing really immense and unprecedented change. We have a fisheries office right in Brunswick, right in Fort Andrus. We have 3 staff members that work out of that office. We also have another fisheries staff member that works out of Machias, so we have a pretty good coverage of the coast. And we really are working to promote resilient and productive coastal ecosystems through applied science and community engagement. And so we work, like I was mentioning before, in really close partnership with coastal communities, with fishing industry members to really try to co-develop climate adaptation solutions. We have a very broad portfolio, and so some of the things that we work on are pictured here. We have a fairly large portfolio that's focused on sea-run fish and really, in particular, river herring. We work up and down the coast on river herring. We do a lot with the wild shellfish industry and working with municipal shellfish management programs. We work in aquaculture, mostly shellfish aquaculture. We do a lot of habitat monitoring and restoration work, which includes oyster reefs, eelgrass, kelp forests. And then we also work with emerging and invasive species and really trying to look at ways to benefit from these species. And so emerging species would be things that are moving north with climate change, so moving into the Gulf of Maine, things like black sea bass and blue crabs, which I'll talk a little bit about at the end of my talk. And then invasive species like green crabs, which is the focus of tonight's talk. So I will just start out by giving a little bit of background on the green crab invasion. They are called the European green crab because they are native to Europe. So this map here is showing the native range in blue, and all of the red areas are places that green crabs have invaded. All of the black dots are places they've been sighted, and then the green areas are places where they are expected to invade. This map actually is a little bit outdated now, and so in fact many of these green areas are now red, indicating they have invaded. They've actually invaded every single continent except Antarctica. And if there was a species that was going to be able to invade Antarctica, it would probably be green crabs. They are considered one of the top 100 worst invasive species in the world. They reached the US East Coast in 1817, and likely that was from ship ballast water transporting them. So they've actually been here for quite some time. But they are certainly an issue that we are really focused on. And I'll talk a little bit more about why sort of right now we're focused on them so much in a moment. But I will just say, in terms of sort of habitat, they are one of the reasons they're such a, bad invasive species is because they can really survive in a lot of different environments. They can withstand really cold temperatures. They can withstand fairly warm temperatures. They can withstand high salinity and low salinity. I've had them in a bucket outside of my house before, and it got really cold. And when I went out the next day, they were like little frozen ice blocks. And throughout the day, the temperature rose and they thawed out and they were alive. So they are incredibly resilient and really able to, kind of live in a lot of different conditions. I'm saying this mostly because Merrymeeting Bay is a very freshwater influenced system, and we've never seen evidence of green crabs in Merrymeeting Bay. However, they are incredibly, well suited to adapting to extreme conditions. And so I wouldn't necessarily rule out that we might see green crabs in Merrymeeting Bay at some point. And the other part of that is that there, as far as I know, is not any active monitoring happening in that area. So, it is possible that they have been there in the past or are there now, and we just don't know it. Um, one of oh, before I talk about sort of why we're focused on this now, some of the negative impacts. This species is really particularly a voracious predator of native shellfish here in Maine, and really the softshell clam is the species that's, suffered the most from green crabs. They, really softshell clams have no ability to withstand predation because they have such a very fragile, brittle shell. So green crabs have really decimated softshell clam populations. They've really decimated the industry for softshell clams. So not just having the ecological impact, but also the social and economic impact on that industry. They also compete with native species like lobster, so competing for food and shelter. They also have, negative impacts on coastal habitats like eelgrass and salt marsh habitat. That photo on the right of the salt marsh, you can kind of see the edge of the marsh is eroding into the mudflat. And all of those little pock marks on the mudflat are actually places where green crabs have burrowed in. And so they really just create this sort of destabilization of a lot of these coastal habitats. So why now? Why are we focused on green crabs at this particular point in time? They've been here for 200 years. But right now, they are really thriving in the current conditions in the Gulf of Maine. And in particular, they are thriving in warming water. So you might have heard a fairly scary statistic that the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the rest of the world's oceans. And this figure here is actually showing that warming. So we're looking at about 100 or so years of temperature in the Gulf of Maine in this graph. And that dashed black trend line is showing the gradual increase in temperature from the early 1900s to present. Then the green trend line, which is a little bit steeper, is showing how warming has accelerated since the 1980s. And then the red trend line, which is the one that we're really concerned about, is the rate of warming just in the past 2 decades. And you can just see the steepness of that red line compared to the others, indicating that warming has greatly accelerated in the past 2 decades. This has been fairly detrimental to a lot of species, but unfortunately not to green crabs. They are actually thriving in this current climate condition. So we're seeing them increase in abundance. We're seeing, sort of those negative impacts exacerbated. We also have seen that mitigation attempts really have not worked with this species. So we've seen a lot of attempts of like trapping and removing crabs, or bounty programs where people actually get paid to remove crabs. And none of that has ever shown to have any sort of long-term impact. And then the other thing that, we're kind of struggling with is just a lack of long-term monitoring data. So it really makes it difficult to understand these populations and, sort of predict how they will respond to future climate scenarios. So this here is actually just an example of some of the mitigation attempts that have occurred, where people have literally removed boatloads of green crabs from coastal areas, but again, just really have not seen a long-term impact of these types of activities. So when Manomet started doing green crab research back in 2017, the first thing that we did was to establish some monitoring protocols and several long-term monitoring sites, and really, an effort to start to understand green crab populations. So these are the 3 sites that we're doing long-term monitoring still to this day: Sandy Point, which is in Yarmouth, a site in the New Meadows River, and a site in Georgetown in Robin Hood Cove. And we're doing intertidal surveys, so any rocky intertidal habitat in the low intertidal zone tends to be a really good place to find green crabs. So that's sort of the area that we target. And this is a really easy protocol to standardize and replicate. And we've actually been working with many, many community groups and schools up and down the coast of Maine to do this work. And so while what I'm showing you right here is just 3 sites that we've been long-term monitoring, there's actually probably dozens at this point of sites where people are using this protocol to monitor green crabs. And all of the data is open access. So there's a website down there at the bottom where we have all of our data available, freely available to the public. We think, particularly with an invasive species, that it's fairly important that this type of information is out there and usable by anyone who might need it. So this is just a small sample of some of that data that we're collecting. We have sort of a pretty large data set in terms of what we've collected over the past 6 or 7 years. This is just looking at density of green crabs from 2018 to 2023 at our 3 different sites. So, one of the big takeaways here is that there's certainly a lot of variability in these populations over time and between sites. However, overall, the trend is that they are increasing in abundance over time. We also collect a lot of other information that can be found in this data set. So, we collect information on sex, injury rate, molt status, all kinds of different things. And this information feeds directly into management and also potential fishery development for the species, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a moment. So we have established these long-term monitoring sites. We're collecting data about green crabs. We're learning more about them, but we still are sort of left with the question, what do we do about this invasive species? Again, we know they're increasing in abundance. We know that their harmful impacts are being exacerbated. We know mitigation really hasn't worked. We know eradication in this instance is just completely impossible because they're so well established. They've been here for so long. So this is sort of what led us to a different approach, which is fishery development, or as some people like to call it, if you can't beat them, eat them. And simply, put, if they're here and they're here to stay, we should try to find some way to benefit from them. And this is not a new concept. This is something that has been done in many different places for many different species. Pictured here, there's Asian carp on that top photo. Lionfish is another. This on the right here, this image is actually a cookbook that is completely focused on recipes for invasive species. So there's really, quite a movement for trying to develop products and markets to utilize invasive species and actually try to benefit from them in some way. When we were thinking about applying this type of model for green crabs, there were immediately a lot of challenges that came to mind, particularly, a lot of the crab that we eat in this country is picked crab meat. And we, really just can't do that with green crabs because they're so small in size compared to most crab species that we're used to. So things like Jonah crab, which is one of our native crab species here. So really hard to pick the meat out. It doesn't really work well with the current processing capacity that we have in Maine. So we started to look elsewhere to see if we might learn from other parts of the world. And it turns out there is, in fact, a centuries-old and very lucrative fishery for soft-shell green crab in Venice, Italy. And that was actually something that a local community partner, Jonathan Taggart, discovered, essentially. So Jonathan actually lives in Georgetown. At the time, he was periodically working in Venice, and he actually discovered this delicacy called moeke, on many different menus in many different restaurants in Venice, and it is essentially deep fried soft shell green crab. And so this was a real aha moment where it seemed like this might actually be something that we could try to adopt or adapt here in this country. So with Jonathan's help, we were actually able to establish connections with some of the fishermen in Venice. And we were able to do a few different exchanges. So had a Venetian fisher come here to Maine. We had a few folks travel to Venice to learn directly from the fishermen there. And basically we were trying to, learn about their fishery, learn about their methods, and figure out if this was something we could adapt here. The entire fishery actually hinges upon being able to recognize pre-molt green crabs. So that is a crab that is about to shed its hard shell, old hard shell, and grow into a new soft shell. That's basically the process of growth in crustaceans. And so this was really the primary thing that we were trying to learn from these fishermen. And this is a photo here, actually, of a pre-molt green crab. It's a very subtle sign, and so that's why it took a while to try to learn what we were looking for. It's basically sort of this shadow and sort of halo area that you can see along the edges of all of the platelets on the underside of the crab. So that's what we were looking for. Once you can identify that, you know that crab is about to shed its shell and become soft, and the soft crab is the valuable product that the chefs in restaurants want. And I always like to point out here that despite the fact that green crabs have been in the US for over 200 years, and scientists have been studying them for well over 100 years, no one knew about this. So we hadn't figured this out until the Venetian fishermen actually taught us how to do it. Um, so I always think that's kind of a, fun story to tell, given that it's really, again, so much hinging on that knowledge from fishers and those sort of collaborative partnerships that we can build. Um, so the next step for us was to figure out if we could make this work in the US. So we started to conduct experiments to see if we could correctly identify these pre-molt crabs, and then hold them in cages until they molted and became soft and were that valuable soft shell product. So this bottom photo here is actually a photo of a crab shedding its old sort of pale shell, and the crab is emerging from the bottom, and you can see the shell is sort of really bright and vibrant, and that's the brand new soft shell. So that was the product we were aiming for. And over the course of 2 years, we got pretty good at this. We actually got to a point where we were 82% successful in identifying a pre-molt crab, storing it in a cage until it molted, and producing that soft shell product. We also very importantly learned that you really need to separate the crabs when they are going through the molting process, because green crabs are cannibals. And once a crab sheds its shell and is just a very soft, vulnerable crab that can't really protect itself from being eaten. So we actually designed these crab condos, which is the photo on the top left here. So just basically a way to sort of individually house these crabs as they were going through the molt process. The next thing we wanted to do was figure out if fishermen could do this as a viable business. So we partnered with two fishermen, one in Maine, one in Massachusetts, who worked on this as really just a side business to their other fishing operations. So one was a lobsterman, one was primarily a clam harvester. And they were able to produce about 100 crabs a week during the spring and summer, which is the molting season for green crabs. And then they were selling those crabs to local restaurants for $3 per crab, which roughly translates to $25 to $30 a pound, which is a very good price compared to a lot of other things. So particularly thinking, of our most dominant industry, which is the lobster industry, maybe this time of year you might be getting $10 a pound for lobster if you're a lobsterman, but usually in the summer you're getting closer to like $4 a pound. So this was, really promising in terms of the market potential. The restaurants then took those crabs and put them on menus for $9 a crab. So the fishermen were making money, the restaurants were making money. And these crabs in these restaurant trials sold out every time. The customers also really, really liked the product. This is actually a photo of two deep fried soft shell green crabs at the restaurant Enoteca Athena in Brunswick. And I think this was sort of, like maybe an appetizer or like small tapas type dish. And I think this dish was going for like $18. And, it sold out every time. So we were really able to figure out sort of the demand is there. there's definitely a lot of momentum behind all of this. There's a lot of interest across the fishing industry, across the culinary industry. So it seemed really promising. This was all in 2019. And so when the pandemic hit in 2020, it really knocked the wind out of our sails, so to speak. So, any sort of creating a new fishery or a new seafood product is always really risky, and people just couldn't take risks during the pandemic. We really saw sort of a decline in interest. And also, unfortunately, a lot of the restaurants that we worked with ended up going out of business. Progress really slowed down, which is not surprising. Everything slowed down during the pandemic. But I will say we are now seeing more interest and renewed interest, more innovation than we've seen in a long time, and sort of this new suite of entrepreneurs who are really taking this idea of fishery and market development for an invasive species to the next level. So that's really exciting. And I will say that this is just a list of some resources, businesses, organizations that have been really making significant progress on utilizing green crabs. And these are just some of the products that are out there. So I talked really specifically about the soft shell green crab product. These are other products that people have been working on developing. So those range anywhere from crab stock to dog treats to crab whiskey, believe it or not. So really a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity. And then there's also all kinds of different uses that people are finding. So using green crabs for bait, using them for compost. There's a lot going on at Wolf's Neck Farm, actually, using green crabs for compost. And then even things like extracting the chitin from the shell to use in all kinds of different products. So really a lot of exciting stuff happening. And you might have even seen green crabs in the New York Times recently. So that was really exciting to see. This article actually features a lot of these innovators who are really leading the charge when when it comes to finding a use for these crabs that just, historically have been viewed as really just a pest and having no value. So I think, I ultimately feel very optimistic that the future holds a lot of promise when it comes to green crabs being used beneficially. So I'm almost done, but I just want to plug one more thing. So another new crab that we are starting to see and keep a close eye on is the Atlantic blue crab. So this is a crab that was historically rare north of Cape Cod, but has become increasingly abundant in Maine in just the last few years. So we actually developed a data platform where you can report sightings of blue crabs. So you can find this either on our website, which is listed there at the bottom, or there's a QR code that will bring you there as well. And so basically we are asking people to report if they see a blue crab. It's very similar to iNaturalist if you've ever used that before. And then you also can view where other people are seeing blue crabs on this website. So it's really interesting to see, sort of they're spanning the entire coast up to about Penobscot Bay, and we are seeing some north of Penobscot Bay, but really much more common in southern and mid-coast Maine. At this point, we have over 300 observations of blue crabs that have been submitted. And then we also began a trapping study in the New Meadows Lakes in 2022, and we've tagged over 140 blue crabs as of this year. So they're here, they're very abundant in some places. And I really particularly wanted to mention this to this audience because they're very capable of living in systems that are heavily influenced by fresh water. So particularly the male crabs. And so I think, no one has reported seeing them in Merrymeeting Bay. It might be that they can't survive in that area, but I wouldn't completely rule it out either. So, just if you happen upon a blue crab or a molt shell of a blue crab, please reach out and submit that sighting to us. All right. I just want to end by saying there's tons of people that made this work possible. Fishermen, restaurants, students, a lot of partner organizations, and several funders who actually made this all possible. And my contact info is there as well. If you ever want to reach out, please feel free. And happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Marissa. That was awesome. And I actually wanted to thank we have a board member on the call tonight, Becky Bowes, and it was Becky who had suggested that I contact you to do a presentation. She heard you speak at IDEX at some point, and
Oh, great.
so word gets around. Thank you very much, Becky. This was great. Um, I have a bunch of questions for starters. I just see one coming up now, but with that range map that you showed us, given the propensity of these critters to survive, I was shocked at how limited their presence seems to be around the world, and I wonder if that's because of a favorite prey not there or the temperature is not quite right. But I mean, we saw plenty of warm water, we saw cooler water. Why aren't they everywhere? Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, they do have a thermal range that they can live in. And so, like, for instance, on the east coast of the US, they're not found below Chesapeake Bay.
Mhm.
That's primarily due to temperature. It just gets too warm south of Chesapeake Bay. We also think a lot of that is predator control. So, in particular, blue crabs, which are very abundant in that mid-Atlantic area. And I'm sure it could be a lot of other things too. Striped bass love to eat green crabs. So, thinking about sort of where these predators are really abundant is maybe also where you start to see some of those range, sort of, where the range ends.
Mhm.
But I will say that map is definitely outdated. They are, almost across the entire East Coast into Canada and now into Alaska on the west coast of the US. So, and elsewhere in the world, I'm not entirely sure, how pervasive they've become. But certainly I know on the west coast right now, it's a huge issue because they're a new invasive species. They've only been there for, 10, maybe 20 years at most. And so they're just starting to really take hold and become very abundant. And so they're really focused there on mitigation and, attempted eradication if possible. But it's just a really hard species to control.
Mhm. How often do they molt? Just once a year?
Yeah, just that depends on the size. It's age of the crab. So in their first year of life, they molt a lot because that's the only way they're going to get bigger. And so, they can molt like 10 times or more in that first year of life. But we're talking about when they first settle from a larval phase, they are the size of a tick. So they molt a lot in that first year.
Mhm.
And then
Yeah.
as they get bigger and older, they molt less. And so usually a crab that's the size of the ones that you're deep frying is probably only molting once a year.
And those are how big? Like 3 inches, 4 inches?
Yeah, I would say 3 inches probably is about the biggest. I mean, you sometimes see them a little bigger than that, but in terms of what you're trying to target for a culinary market for a soft shell, usually, yeah, about 3 inches across the carapace.
And are the Chesapeake crabs that are soft shells, are those blue crabs or are those a different?
Those are blue crabs. Yep.
Okay, so they get to be quite a bit bigger. But
Yeah, they're much bigger. I mean, the ones that we're getting in the new meadows are gigantic compared to compared to a green crab rather. Yeah.
it was interesting hearing about the Venetians eating these at the molt phase, and really other folks not having caught on to that. Um, Years ago, I wondered, how did people keep smelt, many years ago? And I think, everyone just pan fry smelt. And and I said, well, I'm going to try pickling some. And I pickled some smelt, and I also smoked a bunch. And I gave them to an old timer here who'd been here forever, and he had never had anything but fried mess of smelt. So it's interesting. So a couple of questions here. Here's a question from Paul. Is harvesting green crab a licensed activity or is it a free for all? And also, how do they interact with native crabs? Is crossbreeding possible?
Great questions. So if you are not selling the crabs, if you're just harvesting them for your own personal consumption, there's no license needed. And they are a crab species that you can find very readily in the intertidal. So I often tell people that I encourage people that you can forage for them, like a lot of, crustacean species, because you can pretty easily find them underneath rocks and seaweed right in the intertidal. And if, again, you're just using them for your own personal consumption, no license needed. If you're selling them, you do have to purchase a commercial license from the Department of Marine Resources, and that license costs $10. So it's fairly low bar when it comes to entering into that fishery. Um, and now I've forgotten what the other questions were.
Well, will they interbreed with other species, other
Yes,
crab
yes,
species?
yes. We have not seen evidence of that. And so the two native species of crab that we primarily have here, I mean, we have several species of crab, but the two main species that people are usually familiar with are the Jonah crab and the rock crab, and those are a different genus entirely from green crabs. So they're not even that closely related. Green crabs are more closely related to blue crabs actually than they are to any of the native crab species we have in the Gulf of Maine. I'm not saying it's not possible, but it's
Mhm.
probably unlikely. And then in terms of their impact on the native species, what we've really seen is that sort of the early young life history phase of the species, they are generally really dependent on this intertidal nursery habitat, and that's also the case for our native crabs. So as green crabs have become more abundant, we've sort of seen them drive those native crabs out or drive them deeper. And so it's really kind of it's not necessarily that they're preying on the native crabs, but they are out competing them for resources.
Mhm. The same person asks about the new meadows. As I recall in your bar graphs, those three sites you had, I think the new meadows seem to be the highest rate of presence or capture. But the question is asking, is the new meadows warmer water, or what's so attractive about the new meadows, if my recollection is correct, why they do better there?
That's Yeah, that's a really great question, and I don't know that we totally have an answer for that. We
Mhm.
see that the population, so the three long-term monitoring sites that we have, the Yarmouth and the Georgetown sites are much more similar in characteristics in terms of they have lower abundance of green crabs. They're a little bit more influenced by open ocean conditions. They're a little bit colder. The New Meadow site is much more sort of in like a river estuary type environment, and the salinity is not hugely different. Across sites, it's definitely temperature is different. The New Meadows is warmer, so that's likely part of it. But also just thinking about habitat availability and the abundance of predators and other species that might be competing with them. There's a lot of factors that might be driving that. I would say temperature is definitely part of it, though.
Mhm. Couple of questions asking how, it seems like you talked to this already, but how have how these invasive crabs affected the native species, and in particular, both people are asking about mussels. Obviously, soft shells are a favorite, sounds like, probably for the obvious reason. But how do they do on mussels, and how are they impacting other shellfish or other critters?
Yeah, they can eat a lot of mussels too, unfortunately. And that's likely one of the reasons that we've seen a lot of the decline in mussels. You tend to see a lot of mussels still on like mooring lines and on the bottom side of floating docks and places where green crabs can't get them. But you don't see a lot of mussel beds like in the intertidal or the shallow subtidal. That's likely at least partly due to green crab predation. Any shellfish species is going to start out small and then obviously grow to a larger size. And when they're small, they're all vulnerable to predation from green crabs. So whether it's an oyster or a mussel or a quahog or a softshell clam, a lot of them are able to outgrow predation eventually. The softshell clam can't because it's just, it's biology. It has that very brittle, thin shell, and then it also doesn't, the shell doesn't close all the way. So it just doesn't have any real natural defense against green crab predation. But any of those species are going to be vulnerable when they're in that really small life stage.
Well, you mentioned on the mussels on the bottom, but there's an awful lot of, I mean, our sort of aquaculture, mariculture mussels and oysters are often on lines, on ropes, right? And when the green crabs are little, I would imagine they could float around in the current pretty well, in the water column. So do you see them colonizing any of these rope farms at all?
I've not heard of it being a problem with mussel farming. I think for mussel farming, they're usually in deeper water and the lines don't go all the way to the bottom. So I think
Hmm.
that they're fairly safe from green crabs. I think with the mussel farming, they worry more about ducks, diving ducks than anything
Oh.
else. But they definitely have issues with it in oyster aquaculture. So often what you'll see, oyster aquaculture is usually done closer to shore in shallower water. And so you'll often see the crabs actually can settle into the oyster bags when they're really small and they get in there and they start eating and then they actually grow inside the bag and then they get trapped inside the bag. And so they can really wreak havoc on oysters. So that's a real problem. But part of the way that oyster farming it works is that they are usually handling those bags
Hmm.
frequently. And so when they do find green crabs, they can take them out. But yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah, I wondered about that with the mussels. Is the turnover enough on the aquaculture products, mariculture products that you're able to kind of clean them off fairly frequently or harvest them even sooner than they might get damaged? Um,
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, talking about different uses, before you had shown that picture, I was thinking, well, I mean, there's an awful lot of messing around with these to eat them or to at least get them to that soft shell phase. And I think one thing I don't think you said um, that's important for folks to know is that the blue crabs kind of molt at the same time, right? More like, you get your soft shells in the spring. These
Yeah.
guys, these guys have a much broader time period, so it's harder you can't just go out and, this week and these 3 weeks in the year and gather all your soft shells. So,
So we have found that there is some synchronized molting. So we do actually see that there's a male molting season
okay,
that's generally in this. So it's usually like May through early July is when the like biggest wave of molting is occurring for the male crabs. The
okay,
females are a lot harder to pin down and figure out, and we haven't really figured that out entirely yet, but we think the females actually are molting in the late summer and early fall. And then for the smaller male crabs, we think there's a second molt that occurs in the fall. So we kind of have a sense of how that is playing out and that there are seasons that you would want to be targeting the crabs in.
okay. Well, that's good. Yeah, I thought they were a little more random, so that's good. But seeing that, I was like, seeing the dinghy full of green crabs, it's like, okay, bring him out to the farm. I mean, this would be great compost or great just turning these guys right into the soil. And back to planting green crabs under your pumpkins. Or
Yeah, Wolf Neck Farm has really had a lot of luck with using them, and they are now doing. I'm pretty sure they're still doing it, but they do like in June they'll have it's like a family day where you go out and people collect as many green crabs as they can on the shoreline and then bring them back, and then they do a whole like composting thing with them. And as far as I know, and I haven't kept up with this in a few years, but they were using them in their strawberry fields and getting really great results.
I think it'd be fantastic. I would take a boatload of green crabs, you know. Probably the price that people would get would not be as much as, you know, in the soft shell mode, but it would be uh it would be better for less discriminating harvesting.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yep,
know, wholesale control of a species like that. Uh, it's a lot better than putting sludge on your fields, right?
totally. Yeah, absolutely.
So, has anyone, speaking of that, just as I say that, have you or anyone looked at, you know, pesticide, herbicide, PFAS, chemical kind of content in these critters at all?
I don't think anyone's looked specifically at green crabs. I know DEP has done some work with lobster, softshell clam, a few
Yep.
other marine species. And as far as I know, they've found fairly low, if any, amounts. Although I think there are some hot spots
Yep.
where, you might expect to see higher levels. The mouth of the Kennebec on the Phippsburg side in particular was one spot where there seemed to be higher levels, and that I don't know if that's, who knows where that's coming from because it's, a lot of rivers that are dumping into that area. But yeah, so but no one has specifically tested green crabs as far as I know.
Hmm. How is a question from Barbara? How are green crabs controlled or used in the area of Europe where they're native? Looked like it was further north in Italy. So,
Yeah, there are fisheries for green crabs in their native range. They, having evolved in that habitat and in that ecosystem, there's just more natural control of the population, predators that evolved with them as prey and just they're not in explosive abundance in their native range like they are here. But there are also fisheries, and I think that I don't know a ton about what, how they regulate those fisheries or, what sort of control that might be exerting on the population. But yeah, they're nowhere near as abundant or as much of a problem in terms of the negative impacts in the native habitat.
mhm. Question from Paul, is anyone studying trapping efficiency and improvement? And I was going to ask, how are they trapped? Is it a sort of a standard crab pot thing, or how are people gathering these?
Yeah, they're pretty easy to catch, I have to say. So we've used like retrofitted shrimp traps. There's not a shrimp fishery in Maine anymore, so there's a lot of people that have shrimp traps sitting in their yard. So we've used those. I mean, you can catch them in lobster traps. It's not ideal. We've used retrofitted eel traps, and there, of course, are traps that are specifically made for trapping green crabs. You can find those at most trap yards. And I mean, I've found that, for the most part, as long as your mesh size is small enough that they're not escaping and you have some sort of like top entry kind of funnel, you can catch a lot of them. We had the eel traps that we used were actually about 3 feet long by 1 foot wide by 1 foot high. So they're kind of, long, rectangular,
Yep.
but not huge. And we, in some instances, would pull 350 crabs out of one of those traps in a 24-hour set.
Wow.
And that's not a trap that was designed to catch green crabs. So,
Uh-huh. And
um,
what do you put in there for bait?
again, they're not that picky, but they do like oily things. So we often would use herring or menhaden or anything like that. I have actually used tins of sardines before. Um, I know people who have used hot dogs.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Is anyone in Italy or anywhere else growing these guys commercially, purposefully, you know, in a inside or outside, you know, but you're like we would do any other aquaculture thing? Or is it?
Not that I know of. That's a great question. I've not heard of that anywhere. In Italy, it's actually a fairly sustainable fishery because they're only keeping the pre-molt crabs and everything else just gets thrown back alive into the Venetian lagoon. So And depending on the time of year, it varies, but usually it's maybe like 20% of the catch is pre-molt. And so, you're throwing the bulk of it back. And so actually
Mhm.
it works out very well just in terms of being a fairly sustainable system. But yeah, I'm not familiar with anyone doing it in a way that they would like be purposely producing them in like an aquaculture
Yeah.
setting.
When you said lagoon just now, again, that made me think of the New Meadows. So they're really doing well in that sort of sedate marine setting, more sedate
Yep.
than the open ocean, kind of open ragged coast, or you know, so which is again why New Meadows may be you know, a good place for them, or want to get saltier, the bay.
Yep.
So
Yep.
interesting. All right. Um, that's I don't see any more questions coming up. I think I've asked you all that I had. Um, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate you doing this, and well, interesting to know about these critters. And yeah, if you want to talk later about getting some, survey traps up here, or grids up here, we can, happy to work with you on doing that. I will say that a number of years ago, I want to say at least four, maybe more, a gentleman who lives on the bay here, who was an avid striper fisherman, but he's not living in the area anymore. He still has his house here, but I think works for Reuters or somebody, and I think he's in Cuba now. But I think I heard from him that other folks had been seeing a bunch of green crabs in the bay.
Okay.
I was kind of skeptical because they weren't quite as, you know, uh, pervasive then, and also, it's fresh water. As I was saying to you in our call the other day, we get an occasional sploosh of salt in here, and yes, it's heavier. Maybe, maybe it's on the bottom, but in all of the salinity stuff we've done in the past, we've found temperature and salinity, the bay is quite the soup bowl. So it's really mixed up, and the salinity levels are really low. And then maybe there's a trap of, salt somewhere that, crab rode up from Bath Iron Works, or
Yeah.
wherever, but it seems unlikely they'd be littered all around here. But so I was a little skeptical, but um, uh, it's not out of the question, as you say. And anyway, um,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we had spoken earlier this week, and I think, just to reiterate, if they are in an area, typically you will see some trace of them washed up on the shoreline. So either dead crabs or more often actually molt shells. If they're molting in the area, the shell is really, can be buoyant and will float. And so you see that washed up a lot. So that could be, a place to start at least in terms of just looking to see if there's any evidence like that.
sure. Well, smolt survey, yeah. Yeah, where I'll have to remember that, where I live out on Abigadasset Point, and the south side of that is where kind of everything ends up, coming out the Androscoggin, whether it's pieces of old shoes from the shoe factories, or stuff coming up the Kennebec. It's just a mile of sort of lured shore for stuff to accumulate on. So probably not a bad spot to do it. So I think that's one more. Few people saying thank you. Really appreciated it. Very interesting. Well done. So yeah, thanks again. And
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
yeah, thank you. And hope folks will join us next month. Bye bye.